Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program with Mark Arsenault, who is the author of the amazing book, The Imposter's War. Just a little bit about our author, and then we're going to go straight to him. Mark Arsenault has covered national politics, gambling, and worked on Spotlight team investigations as a staff reporter for the Boston Globe, which won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing. This is his first nonfiction book. This, of course, being The Imposter's War, which I already told you. Mark, we are so thrilled to have you, and I'm going to turn things directly over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. That's great. Oh, thank you. It's a tremendous honor to be invited here. I really appreciate that. So thank you very much. So I think to begin, I just would like us, if we could just consider a philosophical question to sort of set some things up. So it's about sacrifice. Everybody knows sacrifice. You know, we make them all the time to achieve goals and aspirations. Like time is a big thing we sacrifice. We might sacrifice a day at the beach, maybe to polish a presentation for work because we really want a promotion. But what if reaching your goals required you to sacrifice a part of yourself? So how much of yourself, the very essence of who you are, would you trade to achieve your life's ambitions? The journalist I wrote about in The Imposter's War, John Ratham, traded everything, his whole self, to get what he wanted. So let's put a pin in that question and come back to that in a second. So the era of American history in which Ratham was famous was the early 20th century and World War I. Because the way the United States got into the First World War is very different than the way we got into the Second. In World War II, America was just shocked into the war by the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's a sudden, galvanizing event that rippled across the nation instantly. But World War I, though, was a lot different. It was more of a slow slide. There was no one big definitive event, but an accumulation of things. In fact, when the war started in 1914, most Americans wanted to stay far away from it. People thought there's no need for me to risk my son on another European war. Europe had wars all the time. So The Imposter's War is the true story of one of history's great imposters, John Revelstoke Ratham. Not that that was his real name. So with equal parts grit, talent, and shamelessness, Ratham became one of the most influential characters in America's slow slide into World War I. He was a newsman, a journalist, and when the war in Europe broke out, he was the editor of the Providence Journal newspaper in Rhode Island, where in fact I worked from 1998 to 2008, and where in fact I met my wife. Ratham made his name publishing sensational, original scoops, news stories about German espionage in the United States. His direct audience was really small. About 25,000 people read the Providence Journal every day. That's not very many. But his work was republished word for word in newspapers in every state in the country, soon making Ratham the most famous newsman in America. The New York Times, in fact, published many of his scoops the same day they appeared in the journal. When Ratham finished the story, he would share it over the news wires with other papers, especially the Times. And the Times would print it with its own headline and a single opening line that just said, "The Providence Journal will say today." Following that, boom, Ratham's entire story printed word for word. Yet, despite all this fame and influence, almost all of this famous newsman's personal biography was entirely made up. He told people he was native of Australia, which was the one true thing he said about himself. He claimed to have attended schools that have never heard of him. He said he was a war correspondent for newspapers that have no record of him. The people he claimed were his parents, in fact, never existed. The woman he introduced as his wife was not really his spouse. So once the imposter stepped into the made-up identity of John Revelstoke Ratham, he never stepped out of character for the rest of his life. At the height of his fame, around 1918, Ratham was a confidant of President Woodrow Wilson. He was trusted by millions of American newspaper readers, and there is no evidence he ever spoke his real name on this continent. So now normally when I talk to groups about Ratham, I tease the fact that in my reporting for the book, I confirmed his real identity and why he created a fake one. And then I tell people if they want to know the answer, then they should buy the book. But I think with this audience, and I know many of you have read it, but I think I have to talk about Ratham a little differently. This is my third presentation I was connected to through Jewish Book Council, and such an honor to be part of it. For those who have not read the book, you may have guessed by my presence here that the real reason Ratham created a fake identity is to hide the fact that he was Jewish. He was born in Melbourne, Australia, July 4, 1868, under the name John Pulver Solomon. This is something that I confirmed. His father, Judah Moss Solomon, was a settler in South Australia from London originally, and was the former mayor of a city in Australia called Adelaide, which is where John Solomon grew up. Judah Moss, the father, was the first ever president of the Adelaide Hebrew congregation. He helped erect the city's first permanent synagogue, and he was ferociously devout. So much so that when one of his other sons, one of Ratham's half-brothers, hinted that he might want to marry a local girl outside of the faith, Judah Moss took out an advertisement in the newspaper warning all the justices of the peace that they better not perform a marriage for his kid. So that was the atmosphere in which John Pulver Solomon grew up. Now, at the time in South Australia, Jews did not face a lot of discrimination in politics or business, even in that time. But that's not how it was in other parts of the world, including the United States. John Solomon came of age in the late 19th century, in a period that coincided with a pretty sharp rise with anti-Semitism, in which Jews were systematically excluded from elite institutions throughout America, universities, businesses, clubs, civic societies. Of course, Jews have been forced to assume other identities for centuries to avoid discrimination or persecution. I'm sure everyone here knows, this history a lot better than I do. So I guess this is what I meant when I started at the beginning talking about sacrificing a part of yourself to achieve your ambitions. I don't know how far Ratham could have risen in journalism under his real identity, but I am positive that the Protestant Yankee blue bloods who owned the Providence Journal a century ago would not have turned their paper over to John Solomon. I mean, the paper did not get a Jewish editor that we knew was Jewish until 2017. So Solomon cloaked himself under the name Ratham as a member of the Church of England, and he never told a soul. His funeral in 1923 was in Grace Episcopal Church in Providence. So what did he accomplish? What did he get out of the trade? He traded part of himself. What did he get? By 1915, as editor of the Providence Journal, Ratham became convinced that the German Empire, fighting in Europe, was a threat to the United States, even though at the time, America and Germany were at peace and in fact had diplomatic relations with each other. He wanted the US, all right, that was completely uncalled for. He has no respect whatsoever. He just comes whipping through here. That was Moose the cat. You know, he came in when I was getting set up. Come on, buddy. I'm sorry. I can't lock him in somewhere because my wife's not home and he's just going to start screaming. He may come back at some point. I'm just going to pretend he's not here. So by 1915, as editor of the journal, Raytheon became convinced that the German Empire was a threat to the United States, a threat that should be forcefully confronted. He wanted the US to join the war on the side of Great Britain and its allies, primarily France and Russia. So Raytheon saw America's reluctance to get into the war as another enemy to defeat. And he set out to grind down that reluctance one newspaper story at a time. His stories accused German diplomats who were stationed in this country of many things, including propaganda, number one, just trying to influence American opinion in underhanded ways, including by secretly paying for news articles in the press that were favorable to Germany. The Germans also at that time established fake citizens groups in the United States that to organize unwitting Americans into political pressure groups that Germany funded and controlled. It was sort of a low-tech version of what the Russians do to us now, with a bunch of guys up in the middle of the night in St. Petersburg, clicking away at fake Facebook and Twitter accounts to try to keep Americans riled up, and so we will be at each other's throats. The Germans did the same thing. They just did the low-tech version. They actually had to sail all the way over here to try to. So Raytheon accused German diplomats of passport fraud, of conspiring with to undermine U.S. banks and U.S. weapon makers, of trying to instigate labor strikes to damage U.S. shipping and industry. So how did he get all these incredible stories that no one else in the country was getting? No other reporter was getting these stories. So he would lie about this later, but he developed some really valuable sources. One was the British government. And Raytheon was born a British subject, as in Australia was a dominion of Great Britain at the time. And in Europe, British and German soldiers were just slaughtering each other across the trenches. So the Great Britain saw him as a potential ally and essentially recruited him and agreed to leak information to him that its own spies were able to develop, and its own code breakers were able to develop that was embarrassing or derogatory to Germany. The British also connected Raytheon with the domestic spy ring of immigrants in the United States, most of them who had come from parts of Austria-Hungary, which was Germany's ally in the war. These folks really wanted Germany to lose the war because they all thought if Germany and Austria-Hungary lost in their home regions, their native regions back home, would have a chance to become independent nations. And these people infiltrated German and Austrian consulates in the United States, usually by taking jobs as office workers or janitors, stenographers, whatever job they could get. So they could eavesdrop on conversations and rifle through trash barrels and take documents and steal diplomatic cables and leak these things eventually to Raytheon. Raytheon leaned really heavily on this group. And Raytheon's other main source was Bruce Belaski, who was at the time the director of a brand new agency in the Department of Justice that we now call the FBI. And a lot of information and rumor went back and forth between Raytheon and Belaski. They sort of used each other until the Department of Justice eventually turned on Raytheon which we'll talk about in a minute. So many of Ratham's allegations in his stories I have been able to confirm. And this was kind of a little surprising to me, that at the center of all his journalism, there was usually a kernel of truth. None of the stories were ever perfect, and they would not pass muster under modern journalistic standards. But to the degree I was able to reverse engineer them and try to vet them, it usually led to a kernel of truth. So in his greatest story, what I call his Mona Lisa, he named a German diplomat named Karl Boyed, who's a German naval attaché stationed in the United States, as the point man in the German plot to instigate a shooting war between the United States and Mexico. The point of that would be, so if the United States was fighting a war here, we would not be able to sell ammunition, shells, weapons to Great Britain because we would need them here for our own war. And that would help Germany by denying its enemies American weapons. So this was in 1915, and Germany denied every word of it. However, 2 years later, the infamous Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by the British, decoded, and then leaked through the Associated Press to the American people. And it showed that Germany was trying to engineer a shooting war between the US and Mexico. So what Ratham had outrageously alleged in 1915 was proven true 2 years later. At the time, the German ambassador, late 1915, wrote directly to the US Secretary of State to complain about one guy, John Ratham, and to ask the US government to rein him in, or at least put out a press release saying you don't believe him, or that his stories about Germany are not true. And instead of doing that, the US government kicked out 2 diplomats that were implicated in Ratham's stories, sent them home. So they were not welcome in the United States in a diplomatic position, and made them go home. So for things like this, John Ratham became a household name across the United States. And more people began to think like Ratham, that Germany was a threat to the United States, that it was something that the US should forcefully confront, and you could even argue was sort of already at war with us by doing these underhanded things. So if Ratham was so famous, I get this question a lot, why is it that almost no one has ever heard of it? And it's funny that when I worked at the Providence Journal, where Ratham was the editor, about 75 years after he last stalked the halls of the Providence Journal, and I had not heard of him for years into my time there. In 2004, the paper celebrated its 175th birthday. And I was put on a team of a couple of people who were going to write a history of the newspaper for like a special section, just really an excuse to sell a bunch of ads to local businesses that wanted to glom on to the history of the Providence Journal, but they needed real stories to go with it. So we set out to do that. It's kind of a big thing to do, right? A history of something that's been around for 175 years. So the first thing we did was go back 25 years and say, all right, 150th anniversary, what did they do? What did those people do then? And so that was in the late 1970s. And those guys, a couple of former journal editors, headed up that project. Those guys discovered a lot of stuff about Ratham and fell headfirst into the Ratham vortex. And they realized, and I give them a lot of credit, in the 1970s did not have the databases that I had available to me when writing this book. They were able to figure out this was probably not his name. They couldn't confirm who he was. They didn't know why he did it, but they were pretty sure that he was indeed an imposter. So I'm reading this stuff written in the 70s. No one's written about it since. And I fall headfirst into the Ratham vortex. What an incredible story. There's this unbelievably powerful, influential editor, forgotten by history for reasons unknown to me at the time. And he wasn't even who he said he was. That's just like a mystery that I found it irresistible. We did the project. We wrote about as much about Ratham as we could in the project. And then I had it in my head for many years that that really should be a Ratham book. And I didn't do anything about it until 2018, when I was working at the Boston Globe, where I work now. The Globe put on a live show. Essentially, reporters would go report original stories and then would come out on a stage with a microphone, kind of like what I'm doing now, and tell those stories to a theater audience. And it was really popular. And I did a story on Ratham, just one little scandal from his scandal-filled life, and people loved it. A little short piece, probably 10 minutes. And the feedback I got made me think, I should really get more into it. I should find out more. I should try to solve Ratham. And that's what I set out to do in this book, and I was able to do it. So why did people never hear of him? And I think it comes back to the fact that Ratham was an actor playing a role. He was already lying about fundamental things about himself. So it was a very small leap to start lying about other things, including his work. So in 1917, after Ratham got what he wanted, and the US declared war on Germany, Ratham went on kind of a victory tour. And he gave speeches in major cities, Boston, New York, Toronto, Chicago, Philadelphia. And his tour was an absolute smash. There was the most famous journalist in America, a guy who had been nicknamed the German spy hunter. And he's giving a tour, and he's going to talk about how he got those incredible stories, which he had never revealed before. So huge crowds turned out. And Ratham electrified those crowds by claiming, falsely, that he had gotten all those sensational scoops by deploying his own reporters as like a counter-strike force. He said that his people infiltrated German consulates to steal documents and eavesdrops on conversations. Now, spies did do those things, and Ratham was in touch with those spies, but they weren't his spies. They weren't his people. He said the journal's own wireless station had intercepted German communications that the journal had decoded and then printed the results. And that was actually done by the British government. They did do that. Ratham didn't do it. It was leaked to him. And the US government knew that Ratham's self-aggrandizing tales of personally pursuing German spies was funny, because in some cases he took credit for counter-spy work done by the Department of Justice. That annoyed the government. Another thing that extremely annoyed the government was that in every city in which Ratham spoke, he warned that that particular city was more infiltrated by German spies than any place he'd ever been. And that did not reflect well on the agency whose job it was to round up spies, which was the Department of Justice. So by late 1917, the federal government had just had enough of John Ratham, despite having traded and shared information with him secretly for years. The Attorney General of the United States, a guy named Thomas Watt Gregory, personally ordered that the FBI take steps to shut Ratham's big mouth. The first step was to subpoena Ratham to a grand jury to ask him under oath about his tall tales about defeating German spies, with the intention of making the transcript public and ruining it. So Ratham was desperate not to testify. And the Attorney General's price to get out of testifying was really harsh. Ratham would have to sign a letter confessing all these falsehoods he told on the speaking circuit. And the Attorney General would hold that letter in confidence so long as Ratham behaved himself and watched his mouth. If he didn't, then the Attorney General would release the letter. You offend the government again, we'll release your letter. So in short, the Attorney General of the United States personally blackmailed a journalist into signing away his right to speak freely. And the DOJ did it was the legal equivalent of dangling Ratham upside down off a balcony. And seeing no other alternative, he signed it. Things were really calm for a little bit more than a year, in fact. And the Allies won the World War. Ratham behaved, but silence was just not his nature. And in 1920, Ratham's return from his government-imposed sabbatical from rabble-rousing brought him into conflict with one of the biggest figures in American political history. I just want to run quickly through this little controversy because it precipitated Ratham's downfall and caused the fact that most people have not heard of him today. The controversy started in Newport, Rhode Island, and there was a Navy base there at the time. There still is, in fact. In 1919 and 1920, the base was overflowing with tens of thousands of young sailors who were drafted from around the country. And they turned Newport into a pretty wild party town, which it kind of still is. Inside this thrumming social scene, gay men who had been drafted from around the country, who may have grown up thinking there was no one else like them in the world, and this was 1919 now, they began to find each other and create their own social scene. Navy brass were concerned about this in an era when gay Americans were routinely arrested and prosecuted and jailed as sex criminals. So a small group of officers came up with an action plan to clean up Newport that is really almost too stupid for words. So they decided to launch a sting operation. They recruited handsome young sailors, many of whom were still in their late teens, to send them out as undercover operatives into the gay social scene. And to gather ironclad evidence of sex crimes, the young sailors would go to bed with the men who picked them up, and then afterwards would take down their name for arrest and prosecution. It sounds like I'm making that up, definitely not. The sting was known as, its name was Section A of the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time? That was an up-and-coming Democratic politician by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yes, that guy. It's that guy, the guy on the dime, that guy. That was before he was the governor of New York, before he won the presidential campaign 4 times, before he got polio. And when the tactics of Section A became public, largely through the efforts of John Ratham, FDR would claim he had no idea how the team had gathered evidence of sex crimes. After looking into it myself, I found that hard to believe. I don't think he was a dumb man, he was a naive man. It's hard to believe he had no idea how they were collecting evidence. Regardless, eventually the sting expanded to the civilian population and entrapped an Episcopal priest by the name of Sam Kent. He was tried for sex crimes in Providence in January of 1920, and the tactics of Section A were revealed in testimony. Ratham and a whole lot of other people went absolutely bananas. Ratham wrote just volcanic editorials against the Navy officers he thought were responsible, primarily Franklin Roosevelt. FDR denied his charges, and the national press fanned this prickly little spat into a clash of titans, the celebrity journalist against the up-and-coming politician. So Ratham demanded that Congress investigate Section A, and they did, in fact. The US Senate designated a subcommittee to investigate, and it eventually pinned a lot of blame on Roosevelt. But at the time, FDR had a lot of other things on his mind. This was 1920. He was the Democratic Party's nominee for vice president that year, on a ticket with John Cox, who was governor of Ohio. And you've never heard of John Cox either, probably. So obviously they lost to the immortal Warren G. Harding. But John Cox, in fact, his business legacies exist today, and there are probably people waiting on hold right now to talk to a service rep from Cox Communications. That was his company. So the fight over the Newport scandal propped up occasionally during the campaign. And that October, a week before the election, Ratham foolishly attacked Roosevelt with a long list of charges that he made public in a public letter that printed in the newspaper and then sent to newspapers all across the country. And these were mostly related to sailors who had been court-martialed and imprisoned in the Navy prison in Maine. Well, Roosevelt approved a number of these men going back to duty, and there was kind of a controversy at the time whether or not returning these men to duty after serving time for crimes like sort of undermined the moral fiber of the nation. Buried in that was a much more serious charge. Ratham accused Roosevelt of destroying evidence related to some of these sailors. That was a really big, serious charge. That was a felony. I don't think it was true, honestly, after investigating this, the records we have available. But it was a really serious charge, and it was a week before the election. So Roosevelt immediately sued Ratham for libel and demanded $500,000 in his suit. And then he asked the Department of Justice, can you help me with this man? Can you prosecute him for criminal libel? Can you get him off my back? I'm about to stand for a national election in a week. The Justice Department said, no, we can't find a crime. However, there's something else we can do. So to defend Roosevelt and the presidential ticket from Ratham's allegations, the Department of Justice released Ratham's confession to the press. And Ratham's reputation was shattered on the spot. All the lies he told on his speaking tour were revealed in his own words and in a signed and notarized statement. So books written about World War I before Ratham was exposed are incredibly generous to him. In fact, say, if not for the work of the Providence Journal, decoding German messages and printing the results, the world might be entirely different. That was not entirely correct or fair, in fact, because Ratham didn't really do those things. On the other hand, he did publish a lot of stories that were very influential in preparing the American psyche for war. Books written after he was exposed dismiss all his stories as the figment of romantic imagination. And that's not fair either, because his stories, to some degree, were generally solid at some level. So the problem was Ratham's lies that he told on the speaking tour had poisoned everything that he ever touched. And that may not have been entirely fair, but at the time, public liars, we published public liars severely in this country. We don't really punish public liars anymore. And as a result, we don't really know who to trust. So it was sort of a rough justice. And what made it even rougher is the writers of history passed upon Ratham the most serious sentence that they could. They left him out. And that's why no one had ever heard of him. So I just want to give you 5 facts. 4 facts. 4 facts about John Ratham. 4 telling facts. And then I would love to entertain any questions. So 4 facts about John Ratham. So the 20-year-old newspaper reporter who was born John Pulver Solomon left Australia in 1888. Spent some time in British Hong Kong and then arrived in British Columbia in Western Canada in 1889. The moment he walked off the ship, he slipped into the fake identity of John Revelstoke Ratham and never broke character for the rest of his life. There's no evidence that the woman he married in British Columbia, who was a school teacher named Mary Crocker, ever knew that her husband had a fake identity. I mean, who would ever suspect that? I mean, how could you even imagine that? Ratham worked as a reporter in Victoria, British Columbia. That was the first place he worked in North America. At the time, he was, in addition to being an imposter, he was a liar, thief, and an extortionist. So he had this little extortion scheme where he would write something terrible about an influential person in town, a terrible news story, and then bring it to them and say, look at this terrible story I wrote about you. Wouldn't you hate to see this published in my newspaper? For a small fee, I could sand off some of those rough edges, or for some larger sum, I'll just throw it away and we'll pretend this never happened. So he pulled that scheme a number of times until he got away with it, until he pulled it one time too many. And the police got wind of it and came to arrest him. But they were just too late, and Ratham and his wife, Mary, had escaped to the United States by ferry in the Pacific Northwest. He worked in Oregon for a while, got fired for sort of the same kind of behavior, and then ended up at the San Francisco Chronicle, where he really became an ace reporter and really made his name in business. So that's fact number one. So fact number two about John Ratham is that he was a beautiful writer. That's why he got chance after chance in journalism. The guy was wonderful. And in working on the book, I read a lot of news coverage from this time period. And to me now, with sort of a modern eye, it looks kind of stilted, a lot of it. And Ratham did not write that way. He wrote in a very vivid, passionate way, which was sort of maybe out of step with his time, but oddly very much in step with ours. And if I could, I just want to read a short passage that John Ratham wrote. So this is not my writing, this is him. It is in my book. But this is something that he wrote in 1898 in Cuba, where he was dispatched to cover the Spanish-American War embedded with American troops. He witnessed the decisive battle of San Juan Hill, and then wrote this the night of July 3rd, which was 1899, which was the day before his 30th birthday. So he was 30 years old as he wrote this. Just a few paragraphs. Overhead is the typical Cuban sky, black as jet, studded with thousands of stars. The full moon floods everything with its soft light, making the hills and valley round our trenches as bright as they were at noon, and throwing back the white glitter of the roofs of Santiago like long beacon gleams right in front of us. Below, at the bottom of the ridge, constant dull sounds and the flash of picks tell us that our men are engaged in burying their comrades. I want to write tonight about our wounded, the Red Cross hospitals, and the methods that have so far in this campaign characterized the medical arm of the service. This picnic war, this summer holiday, as some of our all-seeing legislators characterized it before the Army left Tampa, has already brought death and desolation to many American homes. I wish some of these men who for months reviled our president for his refusal to rush into battle, who talked of taking Havana with 5,000 men, could see what I have seen the past 3 days. Is there any sight, I wonder, more depressing in its effect, more lasting in its memories, or more heartrending than a field hospital hastily erected in the wake of an army? Men, strong, full of young manhood, bunches of vitality and enthusiasm, march along a winding bog to where the enemy waits. The crack of Gatlings, the whistle of Mauser bullets, the shriek of the devilish shells and shrapnel fill the air, and the gray-faced doctors and Red Cross nurses make ready quietly, but with business-like activity for what they know will come back by that country road. So, I mean, I'm a fan of news writing. I find that depiction mesmerizing. I'm It's wonderful. It feels fresh, modern. It's not what we would call a traditional news story. It's written more like a column, but you can feel more than 100 years later, sort of the rage and the passion, and you can see the scene. Raytheon wrote another one of his other big assignments that I found incredibly moving when I first read it. He worked in 1903. He was at the Chicago Record Herald when the Iroquois Theater burned down and killed 600 people, and it is still the deadliest single building fire in American history. And the editors needed some writer under unthinkable pressure to take the feeds that were coming in from reporters being called in from all over the city, from the scene, from the fire department, from the hospital, from the mayor's office, every place where reporters fanned out to find the news. Those people were calling their reporting back into a transcriptionist, and those transcriptions landed on somebody's desk, and that was John Raytheon, and it was his job to take those separate pieces and weave them together into a cohesive narrative that not only told you what happened that day, but conveyed the overwhelming emotional power of what it was like to be in Chicago the day of that fire. And under unbelievable deadline pressure, he had to do it. And he had a matter of hours to complete this. And it is a masterful work. And I know a lot about how he felt, because when the Boston Marathon was bombed, 10 years ago, next April, that was my job. I took the feeds. I was the person who the feeds came into in the Boston Globe newsroom. I didn't expect to be. I was covering gambling at the time and casino development. I filed a little story, and I thought I might get out of here early today. And we heard something was going on at the finish line. We weren't sure where it was, but it sounded serious. I just mentioned to an editor, hey, I filed already, so if you need a writer, I'm available. Suddenly, without even anyone telling me, stuff just started coming to me. I was overwhelmed with, oh God, scenes from the site, from the hospital. I mean, 200 victims taken to every hospital around the city, from families, from experts, from the police, from the president of the United States. And I take all those and then again, weave them into a cohesive narrative that tells you what happened, but also conveys the emotional power of what it was like to be in Boston that day. It is an overwhelming task, and editors are walking around and their eyes are big because they're scared and they want you to finish. Like, give us something to read. And the clock is going like this fast, coming up before deadline. So it is unthinkable pressure. And so I felt, when I read Raytheon's story, I felt a kinship for him. And I felt like our relationship changed when I read that piece. Okay, fact number 3 about John Raytheon. Telling fact number 3 is his mistress, Florence, tried to steal Raytheon away from his wife, Mary, by framing Mary for attempted murder. And it worked, sort of worked. So it was 1899. Raytheon was working as a reporter in San Francisco. At the time, the whole nation was mesmerized by the trial of a San Francisco woman who happened to be named Cordelia Botkin. It's a tremendous case, if you want to look it up. She was convicted of murder after sending her lover's wife poison candy through the mail. She murdered her in Delaware from San Francisco with a box of poison candy sent through the mail. No one had ever seen a case like that. It had never happened before. So that was all over the news. So at the same time, Raytheon had moved out from his wife, Mary, and shacked up with his lover, Florence, just actually a couple blocks away. At one point, Florence got a lovely little package delivered in the mail. Blue, tied up with white twine. The handwriting didn't have a return address. The handwriting was clearly Mary Raytheon's. However, oddly, the address appeared to have been clipped from another envelope and pasted onto the package. Whatever, she opened it up. Inside was a little wicker basket, and in the wicker basket were some candied cherries. So she had some, she gave some to her landlady. People who were in the house are like, don't you read the news? Don't you know you're not supposed to eat candy that comes in the mail? But they just laughed that off until I got really ill later that day. Like seriously ill. They both survived, the landlady and Florence. However, Ratham took the candies to a chemist, had them tested, and it was reported back that they had enough arsenic in them to kill a herd of cows. So they had no choice but to bring that to the police. Police got involved. This became a national story. That sort of sounds like a tabloid TV story, but the reporters of the late 19th century did their absolute best with it. And this was splashed everywhere. It was in the New York Times. It was in papers in every state in the country. The sort of love triangle between the reporter, the wife, the mistress, with the poison cherries. The police spent about 3 weeks investigating. They did a really good job, old-fashioned gumshoe police work. They traced the basket back to where it had been bought. They traced the arsenic back to where it had been bought. Got the clerks from those establishments to the police station, invited Florence, the mistress, down for more questioning, where she was identified by the clerks as the person who bought those items. And under questioning, she cracked, yes, it was me. I sent the poison candies to myself because Mary Ratham threatened to name me as a co-respondent in a divorce case. That would be very embarrassing to me because that would out me as someone who had an adulterous affair with a married man. I thought if I somewhat framed her, I would have something over on her, and I could stop her from doing it. So this, of course, went to the district attorney, who said, I don't know what I can do about this. It's not illegal to mail yourself arsenic. The legislators of California had just not come up with anyone like Florence. They just had not anticipated anyone like Florence. So she went free. By this point, Mary Ratham had enough. She moved back to British Columbia, back to in with her mom, where she was before. She met John Ratham. In fact, became a very prolific poet who wrote hundreds of poems, published all over Canada. And then Ratham and Florence, at this point, had to leave San Francisco after this debacle, and they started coming east, stopped in Chicago, and then eventually ended up in Providence. So the fourth and final telling fact I'd like to talk about John Ratham is that he died shortly after his humiliating fall from grace, after his confession was revealed in 1923 at the age of 56. He left no known children with him, who knows, but none that we know of. He's buried in Providence, Rhode Island, in an unmarked grave. I've been there. There's no stone. There never was. So why? My guess, why there is no stone. My guess, he did not want to rest forever under the name John Ratham because he did not want to repose for eternity beneath a lie. I think he chose a memorial of nothingness for himself to honor that elemental part of himself that he sacrificed as a young man on the altar of professional ambition, which was his true identity, including his Jewish identity. So with that, thank you. I went on longer than I thought I was going to, but I will take questions for as long as you guys want to stay on.
Thank you so much. That was totally fascinating. And I know we do have some questions, so I'm going to start with Mark and Marcia.
Okay. Yeah, I read your book and it was fascinating. Filled in a whole lot of interesting gaps in an era I knew something about, but not this. So number one, I'm curious. I mean, he seemed like quite an opportunist, and I'm just wondering that if it had, first of all, were the Brits also doing these kinds of spy things? And if so, could it have just as easily, was he really anti-German, or could this have gone the other way if the if he'd been fed information about terrible things the British were doing, and would he have jumped on that and made hay out of that instead?
Well, that's a tremendous question. I think probably not. One interesting thing about Raytheon is that you read the book. So the first major national scoop that he was able to write, in fact, was wrong. He had been fed misinformation by a German agent, but that scoop was embarrassing to the British. So his very first foray into this was an actual relatively honest attempt to commit journalism. And, you know, I mean, yes, he wanted the credit, and he wanted to, you know, he was publishing journalism done by other people who were writing about the most important story of anyone's lifetime at that point, the first World War. He wanted in on that action. He finally got a chance to do it. He was snookered into publishing essentially black propaganda on the part of the German Empire. He, you know, eventually, I feel like that he was burned by that, and not long after that, the one thing that I think really did affect him and change the way he saw his role was the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. I kind of see that as, I think that's the way I put it in the book. It's not that he was broken by that, but something in him may have been mended by that, and the horror of that. In fact, I had this line in the book, but the editor took it out for some reason, which is, I felt like, to me, it struck me as like, you know, in old black and white Westerns, someone's drunk, you slap them and you sober them up with one slap. And that's why I feel like sort of what the Lusitania did for Raytheon. It was like he was slapped sober. And, you know, never after that did we hear of him doing any extortion or anything. I feel like he became a different person somewhat. I mean, he's still, you know, a liar and grifter and imposter and fabulous in some sense, and a self-promoter, and, you know, he certainly had a lot going on. But I feel like he would not have, I mean, the British were doing things, propaganda, absolutely. I mean, they weren't doing the sabotage the Germans were doing, because the British were benefiting by American industry, because the British Navy controlled the Atlantic, so they could freely buy stuff from the United States. So could the Germans too, but they couldn't get it home because British ships would intercept it. So all these things that the German Empire did, all that the diplomats did, the underhanded things they did in the United States, all went back to the fact that the British could freely import whatever they wanted from the United States, and Germany, for the most part, could not. So I don't think he would have, because I feel like his personal sympathies were just too much on the British side.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Marcia and Mark, was that your last question?
Oh, I've got a lot of questions, but I think Sandy wants to ask
Oh,
something.
okay, thank you. Sandy?
Number one, is that candy store still in existence?
Candy store.
Oh, the
To get
poison?
the cherry candies.
Oh. I know, let's see now. I think it was called the Emporium, and it was destroyed in the San Francisco earthquake.
Tragedy. The next question is, the British were dealing with a very hostile US administration at the time of the early years of World War I. And they were masters at identifying individuals that could put forth their arguments. I don't know where Raisman went to school.
He was educated.
Arguments, the British?
He was educated in Australia.
Okay, and the British had a network of people that were identifying. Obviously, he was a brilliant writer.
Yes.
But the British had a legion of people who were identifying people like this that could put forth their point of view, because they were dealing with a very isolationist United States at the time and a very hostile administration to them.
Yeah, true.
I'm not saying he was wrong. in supporting the British. I'm just saying that he was, to some extent, used by them.
Oh, yeah, certainly. And I think he used them back too. I mean, he became a star based on a lot of information that they leaked to him. So I think it was a marriage that both parties got something what they wanted out of it.
Thank you. Susan.
You started out by talking about individuals making sacrifices to become or to get something that they really wanted, and how much of their personality or identity they would sacrifice. But isn't it possible that he didn't feel that he was sacrificing very much? Maybe he wanted to shed his Jewish identity, and maybe he even didn't like it. I mean, do we know enough about his identification as a Jew in his early years?
Thanks, a great question. We know that, well, he was from, I mean, that his family was incredibly devout and very, very serious. And we don't know, there's not a lot of information that survived about what like little John Pulver Solomon believed at the time. But we know, I mean, I've inferred from his family and how, I mean, his father was one of the most prominent Jews in all of South Australia. And in his time, and a politician, a former member of parliament, and his Ratham's half-brother became the first Jewish prime minister of South Australia. And that was something that the family is still proud of today. And I've been in contact with Ratham's, well, they're not direct relatives, he didn't have any kids, but his distant relatives now still live in the Adelaide area around Australia. And we've been in touch. I spoke at their family reunion over Zoom. It was the middle of the night for me. I was up there in the middle of the night, giving a little talk about Ratham, and they were absolutely delighted by it. The only evidence, and I did look, what did Ratham ever tip his hand in the Providence Journal about his real identity? And this is in the book at the very end of the book, that he, on the day the war ended, which was November 11th, 1918, that day he set on his editorial page, which appeared the next day, the words of Psalm 100. And when I first saw that, I'm like, oh, this feels, when I didn't know his background, I saw this 15 years ago at the journal, when I was at the Journal, I thought, well, this feels Christian to me, because I recognized it, I'm Catholic. And it was the King James translation. Only later did I realize how important that Psalm 100 is for a Jewish person, especially in his era. And I thought, maybe on the first day of peace, he would print this ancient this ancient poem of hope. It just made me feel like maybe that was his little wink, to the person he used to be. Thank you for the question.
Roberta Cooperman.
Just to follow up, first I read the book.
Oh, great, thank you.
Thank you for writing it. It was a part of history I had no information about, and I found it quite interesting. I told my husband he has to read it. But to piggyback what Susan said about, did he want to shed his identity? The little glimpse that you gave when he chose a career, he said, I want to be a reporter because my father would be very proud of that. So I think if he was wanting to reject that part of his, heritage or his father, he would have shied, you wouldn't have included that in your book. I mean, that struck me. And the only, you talked about it, and you talked about it today in your talk about when another child, a half brother, wanted to marry out of the religion, but you didn't inform, well, he thought that was right or wrong or terrible. So I do think it was ambition. I think he was totally driven. And I loved your beginning. How much of yourself do you sacrifice?
Thank
I
you.
thought that was an excellent way to present. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberta. That's very nice. Thank you for that.
Raise your hand.
Mark and Marcia, I'm going to go back to you. If anyone else wants to ask a question, just let me know in the chat box. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for writing this. Like Marcia, I thought I knew a fair amount about this period, but you open up a whole new avenue. And one
Thanks.
thing I'm wondering is, you talk about how some of what he did, sort of after the war destroyed the whole narrative, and there became the perception that a lot of what was said during the war about the Germans was lies,
Right.
which actually really impacted the period before, when the war was going on in Europe in the 30s, where, and the reports were coming back from what the Nazis are doing, and everybody said, well, they're just making it up again. And since I just like your assessment, I mean, there was a government propaganda ministry and other stuff that went on, but to what degree do you think Ratham, as opposed to other participants in this, was responsible for that narrative? I mean, how much of that can be put on him, or was he just one of many?
No, that's tough. But I guess I haven't thought about things in that way. I think his contemporary writers who wrote about him in 1918, 1919, before he was exposed, give him tremendous credit for his scoops and their influence. And I mean, the World's Work magazine, I quote that in the book as well. I mean, they said that his feats of journalism were some of the most impressive in the entire pre-war period. And certainly, I think no one demonstrates his impact more than the Germans. They did all kinds of things to try to get rid of him, to try to tear him down. They investigated his background. They wrote, they tried to write hit pieces to undermine him. They pleaded with the Secretary of State to get, Ratham shut up, or at least to have the government disavow him. So certainly the Germans knew what his influence were. But I think I guess I would have to think about it more. Like, what was what did his exposure, what kind of impact did his exposure have about the way we looked at whether or not a report from Europe was credible or not? I guess I would have to think about it. Maybe I could email you.
And if I may, speaking of the German attempts to tear him down, when I saw the picture of George Sylvester Viereck, even before I got to the text about him in your book, I did this double take because I've been listening to Rachel Maddow's Ultra podcast.
Mhm. I have not listened to it.
Well, it's about the US in the 30s and 1940 and armed insurrection then and all that other stuff that now rings true again.
Yeah.
But she has an entire episode about Viereck.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
Oh my God, it all comes together.
Yeah, it's all one big story, right?
So I'd recommend it just as
that's a great idea. I will check that out. Thank you very much.
And the other thing that I just wanted to ask you, I looked at the Wikipedia entry on Ratham, and it was updated on October 20th or 22nd of this year.
Mhm.
And it mentions his original name. I was wondering if you had anything to do with that, or whether...
I did not. I've never edited a Wikipedia entry, so I'm not even sure I would know how to do it.
But somebody did it recently, and
Okay.
they did it with a couple of the things that you found out that I don't think were known before. So
Oh, great. It's great. Thank you. I was one of the great highs of doing the book was, a couple pieces of evidence I got to confirm that name. It was something I said the name was something that the Providence Journal editors in the 1970s investigating this heard that name from a archivist in Melbourne. As you know, Ratham, he always was consistent. He was born July 4th, 1868. So they went to the vital records and asked, and a librarian at the state library said, well, I've got one baby born in Melbourne, one male baby born in Melbourne that day. His name was John Solomon. And you know, they didn't know. I mean, they didn't have the details. They didn't, but they did have the name. And for me, it was a lot easier. And I did stand on their backs. I'm sorry that neither of them lived to see this book come out. I stood on their backs. That's not what killed them. That's not what killed them. I stood on their work, and it's a lot easier to confirm a name than it is to come up with a name that you don't know. So I was able to confirm it, and I was able to take the research they did in the 1970s and bring it to its conclusion. So that was enormously satisfying.
Yeah, no, the research job you did on that was amazing.
Thank you. Fun too.
So I just want to thank you, Mark, for this, your incredible book, and this opportunity to learn from you and to hear you tell part of John Ratham's story. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, we hope that you will get it. Of course, it's called The Imposter's War, and we'd like to say you could pick it up at the Dolphin, but as we know, the Dolphin has sadly closed. So we hope that you order it on Amazon. And two ways that you can help Mark get this story out is if you do order on Amazon, you can write a review on Amazon. And if you don't order on Amazon, you can write a review on Goodreads, and that really makes a difference. And so I encourage you to do that. This presentation has been recorded, and I will be sending it out to you. I encourage you to share it with friends so they too can learn from Mark about John Ratham. Mark Arsenault, we're so incredibly grateful to you for your time. Once again, Mark Arsenault, the book is The Imposter's War.
Thank you very much. A total honor to be here. An honor to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everyone.